The morning the river took my home, I was standing in my garden in rubber boots, watching the water rise the way you watch something terrible happen when your body already knows it is too late to run. I had lived on that stretch of land outside Pemberton, British Columbia, for 31 years. My late husband Gerald built the house with his brother one summer before we married, framing every wall by hand, laying the porch boards in rows so straight they looked like they had been drawn with a ruler. We raised 2 children there. We buried 2 dogs in the backyard. We grew old together in that kitchen, watching the mountains shift from green to white to green again, season after season, until Gerald's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in October, and I became the only keeper of all that history. When the flooding started, I did not believe it would reach us. The valley had seen high water before. The creek had swollen twice since I moved to Pemberton, and both times it had retreated before touching the house. But that year the snowpack in the mountains was heavy, and the spring had been unseasonably warm, and nobody understood how quickly everything could change until the change had already happened. By noon, the water was at the garden's edge. By 2 o'clock, it was in the mudroom. By 4, I was standing on the second-floor landing listening to the rooms below fill with a sound I have no good word for. Not a rush, not a crash, a slow, patient swallowing. I waded out through the front door, carrying a canvas bag with my medications, Gerald's watch, and the folder of documents my accountant had always told me to keep within reach. I climbed into my truck, which I had parked on the road above the property the night before when I first noticed the creek running too fast. I sat there in the cab with the heat running and watched the water claim the first floor of the house Gerald built. By the time rescue volunteers reached our road, there was nothing for them to do except tell me the bridge downstream had washed out and I would need to be rerouted to temporary shelter in town. I thanked them and drove away before they could see me cry. I was 63 years old. I had $340 in my wallet and nowhere to go that felt like mine. My son, Derek, lived 40 minutes away in Squamish. He and his wife Pamela had a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement they used as a home gym and an office Derek had never worked in. We had not been close in the years since Gerald passed, not because of any single argument, but because of the slow accumulation of missed calls and shortened visits and the quiet understanding that I reminded Derek of a version of himself he preferred to leave behind. The version that grew up in a small house without new shoes every season. The version that learned early that wanting things did not make them appear. I called him from the truck in the evacuation parking lot. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him what had happened. I told him the house was gone. I told him I needed a place to stay while I figured out my next step. There was a pause. Then I heard him exhale slowly, the kind of exhale that carries a decision in it. He said the basement was being renovated. He said Pamela's mother had already booked their guest room for the following month, and they needed time to prepare for her visit. He said maybe I could try one of the hotels in Whistler, just until things settled down. He said he would send me some money to help with the first few nights. I held the phone against my ear and listened to every word. I did not argue, I did not beg. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a very long time staring at the water rolling down the street outside the lot. He did not send the money. That was the moment I understood something I had been reluctant to admit for years. Derek had built a careful distance between himself and anything that felt like need. And I, arriving at his door as a woman who had just lost everything, was the most uncomfortable shape of need he could imagine. I drove to the nearest motel. I paid for 2 nights with my credit card and told myself I would think of something. That night, alone in a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and recycled air, I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts the way you search through an old coat pocket, half expecting to find nothing. Names I had not spoken in years passed under my thumb. Acquaintances. Former neighbors. The women I used to trade garden cuttings with before Gerald died and the socializing slowly stopped. Then I came to a name that had not changed in 17 years. Nora Vasquez. I stopped scrolling. Nora had grown up on the property directly east of ours. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses in town and worked evenings at a bingo hall in Whistler to keep them afloat. Her father had gone back to Mexico when Nora was 4 and never returned. From the time Nora was 11 until she left for university at 18, she spent more time in my kitchen than in her own. It started simply enough. Rosa worked the evening shift 3 nights a week, and she worried about Nora being alone. She knocked on my door one Thursday and asked if Nora could come by for dinner when she was working. I said, of course. That one request became a standing arrangement that eventually became something no one had to arrange at all. Nora simply appeared. She was a serious child, not cold, but deliberate. She chose her words carefully. She read anything I put in front of her, and some things I had not meant to leave within her reach. She helped me fold laundry without being asked. She taught my daughter how to braid hair. She sat beside Gerald at the dining table and listened to him talk about the history of the valley with an attention he rarely received from our own children. When she was 14, she came to me in tears over a science project that required a microscope her school did not have. I drove her to the library in Pemberton, then to another one in Whistler, then helped her apply for a learning grant through the province that covered the cost of a basic lab kit she could keep. She looked at that kit the morning it arrived like it was a door opening. By the time she was 16, Nora had won 2 regional science competitions and been invited to a program for advanced students at the University of British Columbia. Rosa, who made just enough to cover rent and groceries, could not cover the travel or the accommodation. Gerald and I paid for it without telling Nora we had done so. We told her the program had covered the costs. She accepted, a little too knowingly, I think, but she was gracious enough never to press the matter. The summer before she left for UBC on a full scholarship, she sat on the porch with me while Gerald slept inside. She was 18 and already looking like someone who would eventually run things. She turned to me in the way she always did when she was about to say something that mattered, with a stillness that made the air feel quieter. "You gave me more than you know, Margaret," she said. "Not just the dinners or the library trips. You made me believe my life had a shape worth reaching for." I told her she had done that herself. She shook her head. "I had the talent. You gave me the confidence that talent was enough." I did not know then how long those words would take to come back to me. After Nora left for UBC, she stayed in touch the way young people stay in touch when they are building something sporadically, but warmly. A card at Christmas. A phone call when something significant happened. A visit during one reading week that stretched into 5 days because she and Gerald spent the evenings on the porch talking about everything from water rights to the philosophy of land use. When Gerald died, she flew back from a conference in Edinburgh to be at his service. She stood in the church hall afterward and held my hand for a long time without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. After that, years passed the way years do. Her work took her further. I heard through Rosa that Nora had co-founded a health technology company in Vancouver, then a second one. I heard her name mentioned once on a radio program about innovation in rural healthcare. I felt proud in the way you feel proud of someone when you know they were always going to succeed. You just got to stand near the beginning. I had not called her in 4 years. Sitting in that motel room with the weight of everything pressing down on me, I tried to calculate what I had the right to ask for. I had been there at the right time for a girl who needed steadiness. But that was a long time ago. She owed me nothing. I pressed her name. The phone rang twice. "Margaret?" Her voice came through the line with the same directness she had always had. "Yes," I said. "It is me. I am so sorry to call like this." "Do not apologize," she said immediately. "What is happening? Are you all right?" I told her everything. The flood, the house, Derek's call, the motel, the 2 nights I had paid for, and the empty account I was facing after that. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding. The silence of someone who has already decided and is just finding the right words. "Listen carefully," she said. "I need you to stay exactly where you are for the next few hours. I have a call I cannot miss in 30 minutes, but the moment it ends, I am handling this. Will you trust me?" I said yes. That was the last time in a long while that I felt alone. The call she had taken ended, apparently, 32 minutes after we hung up. I know this because at the 33rd minute, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a woman named Patricia who introduced herself as Nora's director of operations. Patricia had booked me 3 nights at a hotel in Squamish, arranged a car to pick me up within the hour, and included a list of things Nora would like me to consider before we spoke again in the morning. The list was 3 items long. 1. Please do not stay in that motel another night. 2. Please do not attempt to contact Derek again until we have spoken. 3. Please eat something. I laughed out loud for the first time in 2 days. The hotel in Squamish was quiet and clean and overlooked the river valley from the 4th floor. I ordered soup from room service, ate it at the window, and slept through the night for the first time since the flooding began. In the morning, Nora called again. She was direct. She always had been. "I would like you to come to Vancouver," she said. "I have a guest suite at my home that has been empty for 2 years. It is yours for as long as you need it. When you are ready, we will figure out the next step together." I told her I did not want to be a burden. She said something I have thought about many times since. "You are not a burden. You are the reason I know what a safe place feels like. Letting me return that is not charity. It is just what people who care about each other do." I arrived in Vancouver on a Thursday. Nora's house was in a quiet part of East Vancouver, a tall, narrow home on a tree-lined street with a side gate that opened into a garden filled with herbs and raised beds. She had built it for herself and, I suspect, for the version of herself that remembered what it felt like to not have enough space to breathe. The guest suite had its own entrance, a small kitchen, and a desk by the window that looked out at a maple tree that was just beginning to bud. She was waiting at the gate when my car arrived. She looked exactly the way I would have imagined her at 41, composed and warm at once, the same deliberate energy she had at 14, dressed now in the language of someone who has earned the right to be taken seriously. She opened her arms and held me for a long moment without saying anything. When she finally stepped back, she looked at my face the way someone does when they are checking that you are actually all right, not just saying so. "Come inside," she said. "Helena has made soup." Over the next weeks, I settled into a rhythm I had not anticipated. Nora left for her office early and returned in the evenings. She always stopped by the suite before anything else, not to check on me, but simply to sit for a few minutes with a cup of tea and talk about whatever had happened in her day or mine. It felt less like hospitality and more like something I could not name immediately, and then one evening I understood it. It felt like the dinners we used to share at my kitchen table in Pemberton. She was doing for me what I had done for her, not out of obligation, out of instinct. 3 weeks after I arrived, there was a knock on the side gate on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it to find my son standing on the steps. Derek had always resembled Gerald in build, but not in warmth. He stood straight-backed in a jacket that cost more than my motel room and looked around the garden with the expression of someone who has arrived expecting to have the upper hand and found the landscape unfamiliar. "Mom," he said, "I should have handled that phone call differently." I told him to come inside. We sat across from each other at the small table by the window. He looked at the room around him without meaning to, the way people look at things when they are trying to understand what position they are in. I watched him notice the quality of the space. I watched him adjust. "Is this Nora Vasquez's house?" he asked. I told him it was. He nodded slowly. He had heard of Nora. Everyone in the valley had eventually heard of her in one way or another. She had been on the cover of a business magazine the previous year for her work in rural health technology. Derek's wife Pamela had mentioned her once over dinner in a tone I recognized as impressed. "Mom," he said, "I want to help. I should have offered before. Things at home were complicated, but that is not an excuse. You deserved better from me that day." His words were correct. His eyes were difficult to read. I asked him what helping looked like in his mind. He talked about the house in Squamish, about his contacts with contractors who did flood remediation. He said he could help manage the insurance claim. He said if the rebuild took time, maybe we could talk about arrangements that made sense for everyone. I listened to every word. Then I asked him quietly, "Derek, when you think about helping me now, are you thinking about me or about what my being connected to Nora Vasquez might mean for you?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. He looked at the table. He opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. "Maybe both," he said finally. "That is honest." I appreciated the honesty more than he knew. We talked for another hour. I did not close the door on him, but I did not open it wide. I told him the relationship we could rebuild had to start from something real. It could not start from an inheritance calculation or a professional contact. It had to start from him choosing to show up when there was nothing in it for him except a mother who needed her son. He left with the maple tree dropping its earliest leaves behind him. Whether he would come back on those terms remained to be seen. That evening, Nora knocked and let herself in. She sat at the table with her tea, and I told her about Derek's visit, leaving nothing out. She listened the way she always had, without interrupting, without filling silences with commentary before they were ready to be filled. When I finished, she said, "You handled that exactly right." I told her I was not sure I had handled it at all. I had just told the truth. She smiled. That is what handling it looks like. Over the following months, what had begun as shelter became something more. Nora had been in conversations about expanding her health technology work into rural British Columbia. Her company, Vasquez Health Systems, had developed a software platform that connected patients in remote communities with specialists in Vancouver, but the adoption in small towns had been slow. The barrier, she said, was trust. People in communities like Pemberton did not trust systems that arrived from the city with the assumption that they understood rural needs. She asked if I would be willing to talk to her team about what health challenges in the Pemberton Valley had actually looked like from the inside. I said I would do more than talk. I spent 3 days in the boardroom of her Vancouver office, working through maps and data with a room full of people half my age who listened to everything I said. I told them about the gaps I had seen in my own life. The hour-and-a-half drive to Whistler for specialists when Gerald's heart started giving signs years before it gave out. The women in our community who delayed treatment because the nearest clinic was too far and there was no one to watch the children. The elderly farmers who would never trust a screen call, but who would trust a familiar face in a small clinic staffed by someone from their own valley. By the end of the week, Nora had restructured the rural pilot program entirely. She announced me as the founding community advisor, and when the program launched that autumn in 6 small towns across the province, it was received in a way her team had not managed in 2 previous attempts. At the opening event in Pemberton, Nora stood at the podium and introduced me to the room as the woman who taught her that caring for someone properly means showing up before they have to ask. I sat in the front row and looked out at faces I had known for 30 years, neighbors and strangers alike, and felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt since the morning the river took my home. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The following spring, Nora sat across from me in the garden on an early Saturday morning while the maple was full with new leaves. She had been quiet in a thoughtful way, the way she had been before important announcements since she was a teenager. She told me she had established a trust in my name. It was not a gift, she said, and she was firm about the word. It was recognition. The trust would fund ongoing work for rural women in British Columbia who were navigating the same gaps I had once navigated: emergency housing assistance, access to health appointments in remote areas, legal counsel for women managing property claims alone. It would be called the Sinclair Fund, after me. I told her I did not need that. She told me it was not about need. It was about legacy. I thought for a moment about the word, about Gerald planting the garden that the river had taken, about the apple trees he had tended that no longer existed, about the ways we try to make something that will outlast us. I accepted. A week later, Derek called. He had heard about the fund through the announcement in the regional news. He was quiet on the phone in a way that was different from his previous quiet, less calculating, more unsettled. "Mom," he said, "I think I have been wrong about a lot of things." I told him I was willing to listen. He came to Vancouver that weekend. He did not come with an agenda. He came with a bag of groceries he had picked up on the way, and while Nora was out, he sat in my small kitchen and made the soup Gerald used to make. The one with the ham bone and the dried split peas that takes 2 hours and smells like every cold afternoon from my childhood. He made it without asking whether I wanted it. He simply made it and set a bowl in front of me and sat down across the table. We talked for 4 hours. Not about the house or the fund or his career. We talked about Gerald, about the things he had kept inside for years because grief, in his case, had expressed itself as distance. He told me that watching his father work until his heart broke had terrified him so completely that he had spent 20 years running from anything that reminded him of that life. He had not understood until recently that in running from it he had also run from me. I did not absolve him easily, but I listened. And sometimes, listening is how the door begins to open again. That summer, I returned to Pemberton for the first time since the flooding. The land where my house had stood was cleared now. The insurance had covered the foundation removal. The valley looked wider without the house there, which surprised me. I had expected to feel hollowed out by the absence. Instead, I stood at the edge of the cleared ground with the mountains behind me and the smell of the valley in the air, and I felt something strange and clear. I felt ready, not to rebuild the same house. That was Gerald's house, and Gerald was gone, and the part of my life that had lived inside those walls had ended the night the river rose, but ready for whatever came next. Ready in the way you become ready when you have already survived the thing you were most afraid of. I told Nora that evening on the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I have been thinking about the valley, about building a permanent satellite clinic there for the pilot program, a small place with staff from the community. Would you want to be part of choosing the location?" I told her I knew exactly where to look. We broke ground in the fall. The clinic stands now on a rise above the valley floor, where the land levels out before the tree line begins. It is a modest building, but it catches the light in the morning in a way that makes it look like it has been there for years. The sign above the door reads, Sinclair Community Health Center. Rosa came to the opening. She was in her 70s by then, smaller than I remembered, but still upright, still sharp. She stood beside me in the crowd and watched Nora cut the ribbon, and she turned to me with the expression of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching her daughter do things she could not fully explain but always somehow expected. "You were there at the beginning," Rosa told me. I told her she was the one who knocked on my door. She shook her head. "I knocked because I needed something. You answered because you wanted to give it. That is the difference." I have thought about that difference many times since. Life does not reward us in neat proportions. It does not guarantee that what you give will return to you in recognizable form or on any schedule you would choose. There is no contract. There is no ledger. You simply do what you do because it is the kind of person you have decided to be, and then you keep living. And if you are fortunate enough to live long enough, sometimes the world sends something back. Sometimes it sends back more than you ever thought to ask for. Derek is trying. That is the truest thing I can say about him. He drives up from Squamish every few weeks. He arrived once during a stretch of bad weather when the mountain pass was slow and did not tell me he was coming until he was already an hour away. He brought that soup again. He sat in the kitchen with Nora and talked about his father for the first time in years, and I sat across from both of them and felt the strange fullness of a table that should not have worked but did. It is not the relationship I would have chosen, but it is the one we are building, which means it is real. As for Lauren, Derek mentioned her name once, carefully, as though testing whether it was safe. I asked if he was still in touch with her. He said they spoke occasionally. I told him I held no bitterness. I told him that time and honesty were the only two things that mattered between people who had hurt each other, and that I had left the door open, and that the rest was up to her. Maybe she will walk through it one day. Maybe she will not. I am no longer measuring my peace by whether she does. I spend my mornings now in the garden behind Nora's house, which has become, in every way that matters, also mine. I grow the same herbs I grew in Pemberton. I talk to the maple tree the way I used to talk to the apple trees Gerald planted, not because I expect an answer, but because some habits are worth keeping. In the afternoons, I review proposals for the Sinclair Fund. Women write to us from towns I have never visited, telling us about the gaps in their lives, the things they need but do not know how to ask for. I read every letter. I answer the ones I can, personally. One arrived last month from a woman in a small town in the interior. She had just lost her home to a wildfire. She had 2 children and no family nearby, and a phone number for an organization that had not returned her call in 3 days. She wrote to us because she had heard about the fund from a friend who had heard about it from someone else. The way good news travels in small places, slowly but with purpose. We had her family placed in stable temporary housing within 48 hours. Her letter of thanks arrived 10 days later, handwritten on paper torn from a spiral notebook. "You made us feel like we were not invisible," she wrote. "I did not know that was what I was missing until I had it." I kept that letter. I will keep it for a long time. There is something I have learned, not easily, not quickly, but with the particular certainty that comes from living long enough to see the shape of your own story from a distance. The people who take from us, whether they take love or time or the benefit of every doubt, they take because they are afraid of what need looks like up close, afraid of being pulled back into something they once survived. I do not excuse the harm they cause, but I have stopped trying to understand it as the final word on who I am to them. It is only the word they had available at the worst moment of their fear. The people who return to us, the ones who arrive at the right time with soup or a key or simply a voice on the phone that says, "Stay where you are and trust me," they are not paying a debt. They are showing us who they chose to become. And what they are really telling us, in every gesture and every moment they show up, is that we were worth becoming that for. Never make yourself small so that someone else can feel comfortable. Never apologize for the kind of love you gave. Never let a closed door teach you that you were wrong to knock. The river took my house, but it did not take what the house was built on, and I have been building ever since. Have you ever been turned away by someone you trusted and then found by someone you least expected? Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this reached you today, if it said something you needed to hear, please share it with someone who needs it too. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.